Avery Monroe had already survived betrayal once, but the most painful realization came later. No one ever came back to check if she had healed or completely broken. Avery lived in Chicago like someone trying to exist without taking up space. She was once a woman who believed life rewarded loyalty. She imagined a steady future, a loving partner, and emotional security that did not require questioning. That version of her ended the day Blake Harrington chose ambition and wealth over her, walking away as if their years together had no weight at all. What destroyed Avery most was not only the abandonment, but the silence that followed it. No one defended her version of the truth. No one stepped forward when her name became a subject of quiet judgment. Friends who once shared her life slowly distanced themselves, as if her pain carried something contagious. In that withdrawal, she learned a harsh reality. People do not always leave loudly. Sometimes they simply stop standing beside you. Her daily life became a cycle of controlled survival. Avery worked as an event coordinator at a luxury hotel where elegance surrounded her but never included her. She moved through marble halls, golden lights, and elite gatherings like someone assigned to a world she could observe but never belonged to. Guests spoke through her instead of to her, reducing her presence to function rather than identity. Outside work, silence followed her home. Her apartment no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a space where time repeated itself without meaning. She avoided mirrors not out of vanity, but because reflection reminded her of everything she had lost. At night, she would sit in stillness, pretending she was fine enough to continue, while emotionally she remained suspended between memory and emptiness. The damage inside her was not loud or chaotic. It was slow, structured, and constant. She did not fall apart in dramatic moments. She fractured quietly in places no one noticed. At work, she perfected the art of appearing stable. A polite smile, a steady voice, and professional movements became her armor. Internally, however, every interaction that dismissed her added another layer to her emotional weight. Blake's influence extended beyond their separation. Subtle conversations, carefully shaped narratives, and social manipulation slowly rewrote how people perceived her. She became someone defined by absence, no longer the woman who was loved, but the woman who was left behind. Reputation replaced reality, and Avery was forced to live inside a version of herself created by someone else's convenience. Everything changed when she was assigned to coordinate a private charity event hosted by Roman Vale. His name alone shifted the energy around her. Roman Vale was not spoken of casually in Chicago. He was described through silence, caution, and fear. Business figures avoided his attention. Politicians avoided his decisions. And those who knew of him understood that his world operated under rules most people never saw. Avery had never met him, but she understood enough to feel a quiet tension at the thought of entering his environment. Roman Vale was not associated with warmth or reassurance. He was associated with control and consequences. The event took place in a luxury hall designed for the city's most powerful figures. Everything appeared perfect on the surface, light, elegance, order, but underneath it carried an unspoken pressure. Avery moved through it professionally, keeping her emotions locked behind practiced composure. That was when she saw Blake again. He arrived confidently with his new fiancée, acting as if the past no longer existed. His presence did not need loud confrontation to cause damage. It carried history, memory, and the unspoken reminder of everything she had lost. Avery's control tightened instantly. She continued her duties, but every step felt heavier. Blake's indirect remarks reached her in fragments, polished words that sounded harmless to others but landed differently within her. Each one reopened what she had tried to close. Across the room, something shifted. Roman Vale noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she was the only person trying not to collapse while still standing. Moments later, Roman Vale began walking toward her, and the atmosphere of the room changed before anyone understood why. Roman Vale had ruined men for less, yet nothing about his presence in the room suggested chaos or emotional reaction. He did not arrive like someone stepping into a situation. He arrived like the situation had already adjusted itself around him. The atmosphere shifted before he even reached Avery's side, as if the air itself recognized authority. Avery remained still, unaware at first that anything had changed. Blake's indirect remarks continued in polished tones meant for others, but aimed precisely enough to reach her. The humiliation was subtle, socially acceptable, and therefore harder to challenge. It was the kind of cruelty that survived because it could always deny itself. Then Roman Vale stopped walking. He did not interrupt with aggression or visible confrontation. Instead, he altered attention itself. Conversations nearby slowed without explanation. Eyes drifted away from Blake, as if something more significant had entered the space. Roman did not raise his voice, yet the room began reacting to him as though he had already spoken. Blake felt it first. Not fear in its obvious form, but pressure, an invisible weight that made his confidence feel unstable. For the first time, his carefully constructed social performance no longer held dominance over the room. Avery noticed the change second. She did not understand it immediately, only that the environment around her humiliation had stopped cooperating with it. The moment Blake's words lost their effortless flow, something inside the space shifted in her favor. Without explanation, Roman finally positioned himself within sight of both of them, not blocking, not interfering directly, but existing in a way that redefined boundaries. Blake's attempt to continue speaking collapsed into hesitation. The silence that followed was not empty, it was controlled. Avery could not understand why this was happening. In her world, power did not usually appear to defend someone like her. She was used to being invisible during pain, not witnessed during it. Yet Roman's attention remained steady, not on Blake's performance, but on imbalance itself. Blake tried to recover socially, forcing a slight smile, attempting to regain control through familiarity. But Roman's presence made familiarity irrelevant. Every gesture Blake made now felt exposed, measured against something stronger than reputation. Avery stood frozen, emotionally suspended between embarrassment and disbelief. No one had stepped into her pain since the breakup, not even to acknowledge it. People had observed her suffering like background noise. Roman treated it as something unacceptable within his space. The reason was not romantic instinct. It was recognition. Roman had lived long enough in a world built on power to understand that humiliation is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, repeated, and socially protected, and he had no tolerance for that kind of weakness being inflicted in front of him. Behind his calm expression was a history Avery could not yet see. Roman Vale did not build his empire through impulse. He built it through restraint shaped by betrayal, where emotional distance became survival. He did not act because he was unpredictable. He acted because he never allowed disorder to remain unaddressed. Avery eventually left the room, overwhelmed not by what was said, but by what was stopped. The absence of humiliation felt more disorienting than the humiliation itself. She did not understand her role in what had just happened, and that confusion followed her long after she exited the event space. She expected consequences. She expected distance. She expected to be dismissed for attracting attention she did not earn. Instead, later that evening, she was informed that Roman Vale's office had personally requested she continue managing the event. That single decision created ripples she could not yet see. Her colleagues began treating her differently. Blake's confidence started eroding into uncertainty. Even Roman's own team observed her with silent curiosity, as if she now represented something unspoken inside their system. Avery returned home, carrying confusion rather than relief. The next morning, she stepped outside her apartment and stopped immediately. A black luxury car was already waiting at the curb. Inside, an envelope bearing Roman Vale's name rested on the seat. Avery Monroe stood still in front of the black car, staring at the sealed envelope resting on the leather seat as if it contained something far heavier than paper. The situation did not feel like an invitation. It felt like a decision had already been made about her, and she was only being allowed to discover it afterward. Inside the envelope was a formal offer from Roman Vale, an appointment to oversee private events for his foundation for 1 month. On the surface, it resembled opportunity, structured work, high-profile exposure, and a step into an elite professional environment that most people never accessed. But Avery did not experience it as opportunity first. She experienced it as control wrapped in refinement. Roman Vale's reputation carried too much weight for anything connected to him to feel simple. His world was precise, intentional, and built on consequences rather than explanations. Avery hesitated for a long time before making any decision. Part of her feared that accepting anything from Roman meant entering a system she did not understand. Another part of her the part weakened by months of emotional neglect and humiliation, recognized something she had not felt in a long time. Value, not admiration. Not love. Value. That difference was enough to disturb her thinking. She eventually accepted the offer, not because she trusted Roman Vale, but because return to her previous workplace felt unbearable after Blake Harrington's public humiliation. Every hallway there now carried memory instead of professionalism. Every interaction felt like quiet judgment. Leaving it was not ambition. It was survival. The transition into Roman's world was immediate and disorienting. His headquarters was nothing like she expected. It was not dark or intimidating in a chaotic sense. It was structured, bright, and controlled with almost unsettling precision. Glass architecture reflected daylight cleanly. Security presence moved with disciplined calm, and silence itself felt organized. Avery quickly realized that Roman's world did not rely on chaos to enforce power. It relied on order. People within the building behaved differently. No one appeared nervous, but everyone appeared aware. Fear was not expressed openly. It was embedded in discipline. Instructions were followed without hesitation, not because they were shouted, but because they were understood as final. And Roman Vale himself remained distant, but not absent. He did not flatter Avery, nor did he test her with unnecessary pressure. He gave her space, yet nothing about that space felt unobserved. His attention was precise, not intrusive, as if he was measuring how she carried herself rather than how she performed. Avery began noticing something subtle within days. Roman did not respond to her pain with emotion. He responded to it with structure. When she overworked, tasks were redistributed. When she skipped meals, schedules were adjusted. When Blake's name affected her focus, conversations shifted away without acknowledgement. There were no speeches, no reassurance, only controlled adjustments that quietly reduced friction around her. This strange form of stability began affecting her more deeply than comfort ever had. Her previous life had been filled with emotional unpredictability disguised as affection. Roman's world, though intimidating, had consistency. It did not break rules to accommodate people. It built rules that protected function. And in that structure, Avery began feeling something unfamiliar: steadiness. The emotional shift confused her more than the environment itself. She started realizing that Roman was not attempting to own her or define her. He was, in his own detached way, removing conditions that kept her small. It forced a thought she was not ready to fully accept, that her brokenness might not be permanent. Outside this controlled environment, Blake Harrington reacted differently. Learning about Avery's connection to Roman unsettled him in ways he did not openly admit. His pride could not process the idea that the woman he had discarded was now operating within a world far above his influence. Soon after, rumors began circulating through social circles. Blake framed Avery as someone chasing status, suggesting she had attached herself to Roman Vale for attention rather than opportunity. Roman's team became aware of the narrative quickly, yet Roman himself did not immediately intervene. Instead, he observed, not the rumor, but Avery's response to it, whether she would defend herself or retreat into silence as she had done before. Avery struggled under that invisible pressure. Old habits whispered that speaking up would only make things worse. Silence, though painful, had once felt safer than resistance. And that silence continued until Blake appeared uninvited at Roman Vale's foundation event, stepping directly into a space he did not belong to. This time, Avery was not alone, and Roman Vale was watching from only a few feet away. Avery Monroe entered the foundation event carrying the same quiet discipline she had learned in Roman Vale's world. But beneath that control, something older was stirring again. Blake Harrington's unexpected arrival did not create chaos in the room immediately. It created recognition. People noticed him not for who he was, but for what he represented in Avery's past. Blake approached her with carefully constructed composure. His expression carried familiarity shaped into politeness, as if nothing between them had ever broken. His words were polished, chosen for an audience rather than sincerity. He spoke in a way that made Avery feel like a misplaced memory rather than a person standing in the present. The surrounding guests did not intervene. They observed. That was what made the moment heavier than confrontation. It was performance disguised as conversation. Blake's tone suggested concern, but his intention was erosion. He aimed to reduce Avery's presence without raising his voice, turning her into a version of herself that others would doubt. Avery felt her body react before her thoughts could organize. The familiar tightening in her chest returned. Her hands remained steady only on the surface. Inside, memories surged. Every moment she had been replaced, dismissed, and silently erased by him in a world that had accepted his version of her. Across the room, Roman Vale did not move. His stillness was not absence. It was intentional restraint. He was not there to rescue her identity before it was challenged. He was there to witness whether she still surrendered it. That silence carried a different meaning than neglect. It was observation without interference, a space where Avery was not being protected from failure, but given the possibility of response. For a long moment, Avery almost returned to what she knew, almost lowered her gaze, almost softened her voice into apology, even though she had done nothing wrong. That reflex had defined her for months, apologizing for being misunderstood, for being abandoned, for existing in spaces where she no longer fit. But something fractured in that pattern. She realized that Blake was not powerful in this moment. He was simply familiar. And familiarity was what had trained her to shrink. Avery did not raise her voice. She did not expose every hidden truth between them. Instead, she chose precision over emotion. Her response remained controlled, professional, and detached from the identity Blake tried to assign her. She refused to step into the version of herself he was trying to recreate. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. She did not apologize. That single absence changed the balance of the interaction more than any confrontation could have. Blake's confidence faltered because her silence was no longer submission. It was resistance. His carefully maintained image began to lose structure under the weight of her refusal to validate it. Roman observed this transformation with quiet intensity. Nothing about his expression changed, yet the evaluation in his gaze deepened. He was not reacting to Blake. He was witnessing Avery step out of a version of herself that had been built through repetition of pain. When Roman finally intervened, it was not to speak for her. It was to end the imbalance without stealing her moment. His presence alone made it clear that further attempts to distort Avery's reputation would carry consequences Blake could not afford to test. Blake retreated under pressure he could not publicly acknowledge. His control fractured in a way that no social performance could repair. The room slowly returned to normal, but the shift remained embedded in its atmosphere. Afterward, Avery expected acknowledgement in the form of approval. Instead, Roman offered only one observation, that she had remained steady when it mattered. There was no praise, no embellishment, only recognition. That restraint affected her more than reassurance ever could. It felt real. Avery began to understand something she had never allowed herself to believe. Healing was not created when someone protected her. It was created when she stopped abandoning herself. Yet that realization carried discomfort as well. Roman was becoming harder to interpret. His presence made her feel safe, but also unsettled in ways she could not define. She was afraid of confusing stability with attachment. Roman, too, was no longer unaffected. Avery's resilience disrupted something internal that he had kept control for years. She was not reacting like people, in his world, usually did. She was not breaking under pressure. She was adapting without losing herself. And that made her dangerous in a way neither of them fully understood yet. Outside their awareness, attention was beginning to shift toward them. In the darker layers of Roman's empire, observers were no longer focused only on threats. They were now studying Avery Monroe, because to them, she was no longer just a woman in his space. She was becoming a variable inside his power structure. The shift became clear when Roman received a confidential report that night, marked with quiet urgency and unfamiliar origin. The investigation had already begun, and what it revealed was not about Blake Harrington. It was about someone far more dangerous who wanted Avery removed from Roman Vale's world entirely. Avery Monroe believed her heartbreak belonged to a single story, one man leaving her for another life. But Roman Vale's report changed that belief into something far more unsettling. Her pain had not been random. It had been positioned. The name that emerged from the deeper investigation was Celeste Warren. Celeste was not just Blake Harrington's new fiancée. She was the daughter of a powerful political family whose influence extended far beyond public visibility. Unlike Blake's emotional manipulation, Celeste's presence operated through structure, wealth, reputation, and strategic control of narratives. She did not view Avery as a romantic rival. She viewed her as a risk to stability, a risk to exposure, a risk to secrets buried under layers of financial transactions, and elite agreements that connected business, politics, and private corruption. Avery's continued proximity to Roman Vale was no longer an emotional complication. It was a structural threat. The truth began unfolding in fragments. Blake had not simply chosen Celeste out of ambition. He had aligned with her because her family provided access to power systems that required silence, compliance, and carefully managed relationships. Avery had not been replaced because she was unloved. She had been removed because she was inconvenient. That realization did not arrive gently. It fractured something inside her understanding of the past. Roman discovered an additional layer that made the situation more dangerous. Months before her breakup, Avery had unknowingly handled event documentation tied to transactions that were now under scrutiny. At the time, it had looked like routine coordination work. Now, it was clear those records could link Blake and the Warren family to conceal financial movements. Avery's heartbreak was no longer just emotional history. It had become evidence. The weight of that truth settled heavily when Roman chose not to reveal everything at once. His instinct was protection, but his version of protection often meant control over information. He understood threats through exposure and containment, not emotional pacing. But Avery noticed a gap immediately. There were conversations that stopped too quickly, details that shifted when she entered rooms, silence that felt structured rather than accidental. She did not need full information to recognize that something was being withheld. When she confronted Roman, it was not with anger alone, but with clarity shaped by exhaustion. She refused to be treated as fragile within his system. She had already survived being broken in ignorance once. She would not repeat it under protection. Roman's flaw became visible in that moment. He understood how to eliminate danger, but not how to share truth without controlling its impact. His protection was built on precision, not trust. Avery's response did not weaken under pressure. Instead, it sharpened. Her emotional survival was no longer dependent on being shielded. It was becoming dependent on being informed. The same strength that Roman had first observed was now turning toward resistance against control. That shift forced something in Roman to change. For the first time, he began to understand that keeping Avery safe did not mean keeping her unaware. If he continued to shield her from reality, he risked turning protection into another form of confinement. Meanwhile, Celeste Warren escalated from behind influence rather than direct contact. Media whispers began circulating through elite circles. Carefully structured rumors framed Avery as someone who had attached herself to Roman Vale for status, attention, and leverage. Public perception began to shift again, but this time Avery did not collapse into silence. The emotional damage still reached her, but it no longer defined her reaction. She had learned the difference between truth and narrative. Roman's instinct was immediate and absolute. He wanted Celeste removed from influence entirely. But Avery stopped him from responding through force alone. She demanded something different. Exposure, truth, not destruction through power. That decision surprised Roman more than any threat. In his world, problems were eliminated. In hers, they were revealed. That difference began reshaping their dynamic. Roman represented control. Avery represented conscience. And in that tension, something unfamiliar formed between strategy and emotion. Roman began allowing her access to fragments of the truth behind her own history. Documents were opened. Records were reviewed. Patterns started connecting across events she once believed were isolated. And then she saw it. An old file surfaced among the records, bearing her signature from a time she barely remembered. It linked her directly to financial documentation that had quietly supported the network now collapsing under investigation. Her involvement had not been intentional. It had been procedural. But it was real. Her hands froze as she continued reading, searching for context that would soften the impact. Instead, she found something far worse at the bottom of the file. A name, Roman Vale. Avery Monroe stood still as the file in her hands refused to feel ordinary anymore. One name kept pulling the air out of the room, Roman Vale. The same man who had been quietly rebuilding her sense of safety was now linked, even indirectly, to the system that had once destroyed her life. The realization did not explode outward. It collapsed inward, silently, reshaping everything she thought she understood. For the first time since meeting him, Avery's trust did not just hesitate. It cracked, not into anger, but into something far more unstable. Doubt mixed with emotional memory. The man who had begun healing her was now standing too close to the origin of her pain. Roman did not deny what she saw. He did not try to soften it or redirect her interpretation. Instead, he allowed the truth to remain exposed. Through calm narration of events, the structure of the past became clear. His empire had once maintained indirect business ties with the Warren family during a period when their corruption had not yet been fully visible. At that time, it had appeared as routine alignment between powerful networks, not betrayal. But Roman had eventually discovered what was hidden beneath that structure. He shut it down completely. The transaction connected to Avery's file belonged to that earlier system, one he had already dismantled long before she entered his world. What remained was not participation in her suffering, but proximity to a network that had once operated under false legitimacy. Still, logic did not repair emotion. Avery felt something sharper than confusion. She felt foolish. Trust for her had never been easy. And now, after allowing herself to believe she was finally safe inside someone powerful, she realized how easily hope could become another form of vulnerability. Her heartbreak returned with force, not as a memory, but as a reflex. The same pattern of being misled, abandoned, and left to reinterpret reality alone began resurfacing inside her. Roman observed her, without interruption. This was the moment he understood something he had underestimated. Enemies were predictable. Systems could be controlled. But doubt inside someone learning how to stand again was not something power alone could fix. For Roman, this became the real test. Not protecting Avery from external danger, but preventing her from collapsing under interpretation. He made a decision that contradicted everything his world operated on. Instead of filtering truth, he removed all barriers to it. Every file connected to her name, every document tied to the Warren network, every record that shaped her past, he gave it to her without restriction, not comfort. Access. Avery began reviewing everything with careful attention, searching for stability in facts rather than emotion. Slowly, the structure of the past shifted again. What she discovered changed the direction of her understanding. Roman had not participated in her destruction. He had unknowingly existed near its perimeter. More importantly, he had blocked the final stage of the Warren scheme months before she ever knew she was connected to it. Without realizing it, he had prevented her from being fully absorbed into a fabricated narrative designed to erase her credibility. The truth did not make things simple. It made them layered. Roman was not the cause of her pain, but he had been connected to the system surrounding it long before their paths crossed. Avery struggled to hold both truths at once. The man standing beside her was dangerous in the way all powerful men were, but he was not the villain her pain had tried to sign. Roman, meanwhile, began changing in ways he did not announce. His decisions started shifting away from pure control toward emotional awareness. Distance reduced. Information became more transparent. His protection no longer only focused on physical safety. It began accounting for emotional impact. Outside their controlled space, pressure escalated. Celeste Warren responded aggressively after learning Roman had given Avery full access to internal records. Influence networks activated. Narratives began spreading, and public perception of Avery was deliberately reshaped again. Blake Harrington reacted with desperation. Exposure now meant collapse of everything he had built his new life upon. His control over image began breaking into survival instinct. But Avery was no longer reacting as before. Something inside her had changed. She now held truth, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a responsibility of choice. She could expose everything, but doing so would pull her deeper into Roman Vale's feared world, binding her to consequences she was still learning to understand. For the first time, healing was no longer about being saved. It was about deciding what she would do with her own story. Roman offered to take the burden from her again, to manage everything through a system as he always had. But Avery refused to step behind him, not out of defiance, out of clarity. She chose to stand beside him instead. Together, they prepared for a major charity gala where Celeste Warren and Blake Harrington would finally face public exposure. But just before Avery stepped forward into that night, Roman's security team intercepted an urgent internal report. Someone inside Roman Vale's own organization had already betrayed him. Avery Monroe entered the gala as someone the world once underestimated, but tonight her presence carried a different weight. Quiet, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The ballroom was filled with luxury and power. Politicians, elite donors, business figures, and media representatives moving under golden lights. Every conversation carried influence. Every smile was calculated, and every step inside the room followed invisible hierarchy. But Avery no longer felt like she was beneath it. She stood composed, fully covered in an elegant and modest outfit, her expression steady and focused. There was no visible fear, no hesitation in her movement. The woman who once lowered her eyes in rooms like this no longer existed in the same way. Roman Vale remained close, but not controlling her space. For the first time, his presence felt aligned with hers instead of overshadowing it. What had once been protection was now balance. Then Celeste Warren entered the equation. She did not approach with aggression. Her attack was social, not physical. Carefully layered with charm, influence, and controlled conversation designed to isolate Avery without exposing intention. It was a performance meant to erase Avery's credibility in front of the elite circle. But this time, Avery did not retreat. Something inside her had changed. Instead of absorbing humiliation, she redirected it through structure. The evidence Roman's system had already prepared was released through proper channels at the exact moment Celeste began her narrative. The reaction was immediate but subtle at first. Phones checked, whispers spreading, expressions shifting as information moved faster than control could contain it. Blake Harrington felt it before he saw it. His confidence fractured as the room's energy began turning away from him. The version of himself he had carefully maintained started collapsing under exposure he could no longer redirect. At the same time, another layer of tension was unfolding behind the visible event. Roman's internal network had already been compromised. A trusted member of his organization had leaked Avery's position and the timing of the exposure to the Warren family. What was supposed to be a controlled reveal had turned into a destabilized situation. The threat was no longer only social. It had become structural. Avery began to understand the pressure Roman was carrying. He was not only protecting her, he was holding together a system that was now reacting against him from within. Then came the real shift. Roman was forced into a decision that could not be solved through control alone. He could contain the situation to protect his empire, or he could allow full exposure and risk everything he had built. He chose Avery, not as possession, not as strategy, as priority. That single choice changed everything. The evidence fully reached its targets. Celeste Warren's image began collapsing in real time as verified corruption tied to her family structure surfaced publicly. Blake Harrington was exposed not just socially, but structurally. His past actions, manipulation, and financial involvement could no longer be hidden behind influence. Avery did not celebrate. Her reaction was quieter than expected. There was no emotional release, no dramatic satisfaction. Instead, there was stillness. For the first time, Blake losing power mattered less than her no longer being defined by him. Roman noticed that shift immediately. She was no longer reacting like someone trying to survive her past. She was standing inside her present with control. But beneath the public collapse, danger escalated further. The traitor inside Roman's organization had moved beyond information leaks. Their plan now included handing Avery directly to the Warren network in exchange for protection and old alliances. Roman's demeanor changed, not emotionally, but strategically. The feared side of him resurfaced not as chaos, but as absolute calculation under pressure. Avery realized the cost clearly now. Roman was risking parts of his empire because he refused to exchange her safety for stability. That realization changed the emotional weight between them completely. Then Roman received the final message, an ultimatum from the Warren family. They demanded the evidence, and Avery herself, or his entire empire, would begin collapsing from within. Roman Vale had spent his entire life being feared, controlled, and avoided, but Avery Monroe became the first person who made him question whether being feared was enough. At this stage, the pressure surrounding Roman was absolute. Business alliances that had once depended on his stability were breaking away to protect themselves. Political figures distanced their names from anything tied to him. The Warren family's influence pressed from multiple directions, attempting to force him back into the kind of man who solved problems through silence and preservation. His old version would have complied. He would have contained the situation, protected the empire, and removed anything that threatened long-term structure, even if it meant sacrificing Avery in the process. But Avery had already changed what power meant to him. For the first time, Roman did not choose control. He chose truth. Instead of limiting exposure, he authorized a full release of corruption records tied to the Warren network and its connected systems. It was not a reaction driven by anger. It was a calculated refusal to let lies survive at the cost of her life. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Financial structures tied to the Warren family began collapsing under verified exposure. Political alliances withdrew support to avoid association. The carefully maintained image of influence and respectability disintegrated in real time under public and legal scrutiny. Blake Harrington lost everything he had once chosen over Avery. The future he believed he had secured through ambition and betrayal vanished under the weight of exposure. He could no longer escape. Celeste Warren's influence also fractured. Her power had never been separate from perception. Once fear and reputation were stripped away, there was nothing left to sustain her control. Inside Roman's organization, the traitor was identified and removed with precision. There was no chaos in the response. Betrayal still carried consequences in his world, but this time it was executed through structure rather than emotion. Yet the true turning point was not destruction. It was release. Avery witnessed everything from within Roman's world, expecting victory to feel heavier. Instead, what she felt was silence, not emptiness, but completion. Blake no longer held emotional authority over her identity. The version of herself shaped by abandonment began dissolving without force. Roman did not ask her to stay out of obligation or gratitude. He gave her something he had rarely given anyone: choice. No pressure, no expectation, no ownership disguised as protection. Avery's transformation reached its final stage in that space. She was no longer reacting to her past. She was no longer defined by who left her or what she lost. She had become someone capable of choosing her direction without fear dictating the outcome. Roman's own change was quieter but deeper. He understood, finally, that protection without trust becomes control, and control, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually becomes another form of confinement. Avery had forced him to see that love could not survive inside possession. It required space and willingness to let go of dominance. Avery chose to remain connected to Roman, not because she depended on his world, and not because fear replaced her independence, but because he had become the first person powerful enough to protect her and humble enough to let her stand without diminishing her strength. In the aftermath, they stood together in daylight, no longer hidden, no longer shaped by silence, no longer defined by broken versions of themselves. Their future remained uncertain, complicated, and dangerous, but was built on truth instead of fear. And just when Avery believed everything had finally settled, Roman received a sealed file from an unknown source. Inside was a confirmation that shattered the final layer of peace. Someone from Roman Vale's past had been watching Avery long before he ever met her.